Today I'm going to touch upon a few things that are in the margins of my work, but I feel they're very useful, perhaps methodologically, to start thinking about the problems of the conference. So I'm very interested to hear what you think. So here goes. Let's start the PowerPoint. In the fall of 1957, on the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, a new Soviet art journal was established, Decorativное искусство СССР, which you see here, the cover. The first special issue opened with a famous quote by Lenin. Art belongs to the people. It must extend its deepest roots in the broadest masses of workers. It must be understood and loved by them. It must unite their senses, thoughts, and wills, and uplift them. It must awaken the artists in them and develop the artists. As a token of such an artistic awakening, the quote is accompanied by an image of a hand-woven rug from the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, undated and unattributed, featuring a portrait of the Bolshevik leader. Rendered in the typical socialist realist style of the preceding decades, it follows the established tropes of Lenin's painted portraits, such as the sideward determined gaze and the tensed brow, framed by a background of clear blue sky. Yet this is evidently not a painting. The portrait is surrounded by an elaborate border of abstract motifs typical of traditional Central Asian rugs, complete with frills on two sides. It is an example of an object properly national in form, and by this I mean narodny, meaning of the people or folk, and socialist in content, according to the well-known definition of socialist realism. The rug also emblematizes the types of objects that would routinely feature in this new journal, all belonging to a loosely defined category of decorative art that included a dizzying variety of things. Porcelain figurines, textiles, fashion, lacquered boxes. The box is a story about Pushkin, apparently, about his biography, and others that cannot be easily categorized, such as these plastic bookends in the shape of fish with seaweed and stuff. Certain objects conveyed a clear ideological message, and here I'm showing you a page spread from an article on agitational porcelain, agitazioni farfore, from before the war and also from the time. So kind of revolutionary themes in the most bourgeois of objects imaginable. This, however, was not necessarily the norm. There were objects that were not as predetermined ideologically, and here I'm showing you, as a kind of cute thing, it's the tapestry on Tallinn that was from 1956. While some of these easily fit into the category of traditional category of decorative art, as it has been long established in both Western art historiography and art production, others do not. Some were projects for architectural interiors, which you see here by Yuri Arndt, one of the key architects of the thaw, or temporary arrangements of art, architecture, and commodities, such as trade fair exhibitions. And here you see the first page of the December '59 issue, which is the Soviet exhibition in New York at the time. There was this moment, if you remember, where there was an American exhibition in Moscow and a Soviet exhibition, and the sculpture actually comes from the Brussels pavilion of the year before. So it's a jumble of a lot of things. It's incredibly modernist centerpiece. So you have also these kinds of things fall into the purview of the journal. Other things are even more unexpected and completely ephemeral, such as firework displays. And this is an article called Forgotten Art, and the image on the bottom is a firework display for a 1st of May celebration in the 30s in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad, and the images on the top are miniatures and drawings and prints and things like this from 18th century Russian firework displays. One of them is celebrating the peace treaty of Nistad, which I think is important for Estonia, isn't it? But it's kind of very often there's a historical a kind of retrospection on these forms into the depth of time, in a way. More specific to Soviet visual culture, other things that fell into the category of decorative art were mass performances of physical culture, or fizkultura, which you see here. And this has a slight historical irony going on there, because as you probably know, Krakauer in the 30s, writing about the Weimar Republic, described these things as mass ornament, these displays of dancers and things like this. And for Krakauer, this was a kind of embodiment of the alienation and the existence under capitalism, but here you have a kind of continuation on the opposite end. So this also fell into the category of the decorative, interestingly enough. At this time in the West, the category of decorative art was undergoing a contraction. Some traditional crafts, such as tapestries and ceramics, were still prominent and occasionally underwent a kind of dubious yet much touted renaissance. Romy mentioned ceramics. The renaissance of the French tapestry is a big theme, and they are actually following it. Here you see an article called The Renaissance of the French Tapestry, and you have some examples of Jean Lurçat, who's the main representative of French roosters. So there was a slight crisis, I think. These things continued, but when you say a renaissance is happening, it probably means it's the last bit of it in some ways. Because in some ways in the West, industrialization implied that much of the art production that had been usually termed as decorative was gradually subsumed by the broad, omnipresent notion of design. On the contrary, the concept of decorative art in the Soviet Union was ever expanding, as attested by the examples that I just showed you. This was not for lack of industrialization or the absence of product design in the Soviet Union. In fact, the pages of Decorativное искусство also routinely featured mass-produced commodities, such as home furnishings that you see here from '59, and most emblematically, cars. Here's a cover from '58. What is striking is that such objects of exemplary of modernity were shown alongside traditional crafts from the republics or outmoded forms of classical decorative art, such as porcelain and tapestries and things like this. And they were seen as categorically equivalent. The actual experience of flipping through the journal is quite, striking from today's point of view. Another Soviet particularity, and the main focus of my ongoing research, is the inclusion of monumental works of art integrated into public spaces and buildings, like these two large murals that I'm showing you here, rather well known, from the Moscow Palace of the Pioneers, completed in 1961. These were necessary ingredients for the synthesis of the arts in the Soviet Union, the synthesis искусства, that was a key component of official aesthetics in many parts of socialist Eastern Europe. Synthesis was often envisioned as a way to assign social purpose to art by bringing it out of museums and galleries and into society at large. At the same time, it was a potent mode of ideological instruction that could also assign socialist content to the abstract forms of architecture, while simultaneously humanizing it, and Romy mentioned this function was also very important in the West. As the thought progressed, this practice also expanded to spaces of leisure, where the ideological content was toned down or entirely eliminated. And here I'm showing you two examples shown in Decorativное искусство from murals in a cafe Neringa in Vilnius, which apparently these things still exist. Not in their entirety, but they're part of a hotel now, and So this kind of synthesis that has a very similar style to this one, but it's more playful, it's more ornamental in some ways, is very important, especially in the periphery. Vilnius has a lot of them, Riga, I know. I imagine Tallinn has. If you could point me to some, that would be nice. Warsaw had a lot of them, and they're actually, cafes become symbols in some ways of the thaw as gathering places of artists, architects, and so on. And writers. Now, in the Soviet Union, the term of choice for such compositions, both this and this, was monumental/decorative art, monumentalное decorativное искусство. And as such, it was also part of the expanded Soviet notion of the decorative that I'm sketching out today. During the 1950s and 60s, most issues of the journal Decorativное искусство had some article on the topic. There's always a mural thrown in the mix, a tendency that continued well into the following decades. These ranged from theoretical writings on the role of murals, reliefs, and public freestanding sculptures in the socialist city, to reports about examples of similar works from art history. There's a lot of work on mosaics, Ravenna, Renaissance, and so on. But also contemporary developments in Western Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere. And here I'm showing you a page spread that I find very interesting. It's published in February 1958, and it's an obituary of Diego Rivera, famous Mexican muralist, also Stalinist, you know, card-carrying communist and everything, so perfect. For this, he passed away in December 57, and here is a obituary that focuses on his mural work. And here's an interesting detail. The article is written by Igor Golomstok, that some of you might know from his later work as a kind of dissident writer and who proposed this heavily problematic notion of totalitarian art, where he throws Nazi art and fascist art and Stalinist art into one group. So Golomstok was actually writing for Decorativное искусство in the late 50s. Now, the hyphenated term monumental decorative was not new to this period. It had been well established already in the 1930s when it was used to refer simultaneously to the two aspects of Stalinist synthesis of the arts: monumental murals and sculptures in the socialist realist style, and the profuse ornamentation that accompanied them and most of the architecture of the time. And I'm showing you, of course, it's a very typical example. Here, the Komsomolskaya station on the Ring Line, which in some ways combines both modes, because there's these very big mosaic compositions of battle scenes and things like this. There's one at the end of the platform too, and at the same time there's these Rococo ornaments in gesso everywhere. The concept of monumental decorative throughout this period, from the 30s all the way to the 50s, was widespread in both publications and institutional structures, such as the dedicated departments of monumental decorative art that could be found in many Soviet art academies already since the mid-30s. Despite such proliferation, the term sounds strange today. It seems to carry an inherent contradiction by joining together two words from the opposite sides of the spectrum, the monumental and the decorative, one being associated with large-scale uniqueness, singular authorship, and the other pointing to detailing, repetition, and anonymous creation. Both poles actually reject the autonomous, gallery-bound work of art and imply practices that are firmly attached to an architectural context, and therefore a social one, away from the isolated environment of the museum. Yet this paradox of the monumental decorative succinctly expresses the role assigned to art within the Soviet discourse on synthesis. At once unique and reproducible, large and small, authored and anonymous, it was a conceptually flexible category, or better still, dialectical. Art was to be simultaneously monumental and decorative, while not fully identical with either. At the same time, any art that was solely defined as the object of aesthetic contemplation was to be avoided. Thus, the only possible definition of decorative art, as represented in the journals here and many other Soviet publications, should be put in negative terms. Decorative art was that was not destined for the gallery. Okay, even though, again, exhibition design as a kind of meta medium was included in this category, right? The journal Decorativное искусство contributed to the popularization of such an expanded notion of the decorative. Its establishment in 1957 should not be seen as a coincidence. This was the apex of Khrushchev's thaw, a bit more of a year after his secret speech of '56, and shortly after the 1957 World Festival of Youth and Students, which is often seen today as a major turning point in Soviet culture. Imprecise and unstable, this sort of decorative art allowed the transition between Stalinist and post-Stalinist aesthetics, since it could easily encompass both. It preserved the idea that art should serve as an active purpose within socialism, and eschewed the exclusively market-driven and gallery-bound model of art production. At the same time, its flexibility and vagueness allowed for a plethora of styles, as well as of modes of art production, that could include the full range of Soviet experience, from industrial products to traditional crafts to high art forms of frescoes, mosaics, and reliefs. And in that way, I think Decorativne искусство is interesting because it does address the quasi-totality of Soviet visual production in a way that you could take from a village in Siberia to Moscow and St. Petersburg to everywhere. It should be noted, though, that at the same time, we saw a systematic suppression of architectural ornament, often referred to as ornament, right, just using this term. In a 1954 speech to an official body of architects, Khrushchev officially condemned the excessive ornamentation of Stalinist architecture as a superfluity, and he used the term излишество, a direct attack to the aesthetics of Stalinism prior to tackling its politics 2 years later in the secret speech. This resulted in a 1955 decree that banned architectural ornamentation, and here I'm talking about a very specific thing, right? Ornaments applied onto architectural facades. That was banned overnight in 1955, and here's an example from Gorky Street, today Tverskaya in Moscow, which is a building caught mid-decree, right? They put the ornaments in half of it and then left the other. Because the decree, when you read it, has a certain urgency. It's like, you need to stop now. You know, it's an excess, it's a waste, it's, you know. So then still, despite all this, the need to assign ideological content to public architecture persisted. And in the absence of ornamentation, this function was fulfilled by monumental decorative art. After '56, ornament was almost entirely discussed within the context of studies of folk art from the various Soviet republics. So you get a series of books like Narodny Ornament Kazakhstana or things like this. And otherwise was retreated from the discourse. While often seen as synonymous in the West, ornamentation and decorative art had diametrically different fates during the Soviet 50s. Again, the survival of the latter, of decorative art, should be attributed to its vagueness and inclusiveness, as opposed to the significantly narrow meaning of ornament, which again is applied onto architectural facade, and that's it. It's external to a work, right? Whereas decorative art is external to something, internal, alone. It's a much more flexible. Now, I will move to Poland. A lot of my work is about comparing things between different political environments in socialist Eastern Europe. I'm trying to do this here in the short time that I have. So a similar phenomenon of flexibility in critical terms occurred in Poland during the 1950s, yet unfolded very differently due to the distinct course of the Polish thaw. I will base my discussion here on the writings of the prolific art historian and critic Aleksander Wojciechowski, who at the time was one of the most vocal advocates of the synthesis of the arts. He was active since the early days of Stalinism. Some of his first texts were published in 1950, I think. And his texts appeared in prominent journals, such as Przegląd Artystyczny, a very important journal on art at the time, and he would eventually become the chief editor of the journal during the thaw. In 1955, he published a collection of his essays that had appeared in the few preceding years, entitled On Applied and Useful Art, Collection of Studies and Criticism on the Range of Collaborations between the Polish Visual Arts and Craft, Industry and Architecture in the years 1944 to 1954. The book appeared in 10,000 copies and was very widely circulated, and strangely you can find it in a lot of American libraries today. The Polish title, which is O sztuce użytkowej I użytecznej, contains an alliteration that is difficult to convey in English. It's a play on sztuka użytkowa, which is the Polish term for applied art, literally usable art, and sztuka użyteczna, which is a term that Wojciechowski invents and means useful art. In his introduction, Wojciechowski reflected on the artistic changes of the first post-war decade in Poland, which were, I quote, not only the new collaborations between art and craft, as well as between architecture and industry, or the new methods of design and construction, the new systems of organization of artistic life, the new achievements in form and content stemming from both contemporary life and the artistic traditions. These changes also concern the specific social function of art, its momentous role in the various aspects of the life of the people. The art formerly described as decorative, dekoracyjna, or applied, użytkowa, becomes worthy of the name useful for the entire society, end quote. As in the Soviet Union, the category of applied art was significantly expanded beyond its traditional boundaries to include all non-autonomous forms of artistic production, of artistic creation which somehow operated in conjunction with some adjacent field of activity, like craft or architecture, or as well as non-artistic fields, such as artistic industrial production. The essays included in the anthology touched upon a great range of topics, such as the decorative arts of the Paris Universal Exposition of 1900, the collaborations between art and industry in interwar Poland, and the development of Polish ceramics, textiles, and other applied arts during the Stalinist early 1950s. A large section of the book was dedicated to the collaboration between the visual arts and architecture, what Wojciechowski described as the most discussed artistic issue of his time. His essays dealt with a wide range of such collaborations. The restoration of historical monuments in Warsaw, Lublin, and Gdańsk. And here I'm showing you the Rynek, the main square of Warsaw, with one of these, faux Renaissance facades. It's presented as a restoration, but very often it's kind of free interpretation of what existed there previously, which had been destroyed, and all this was, as you know, destroyed during the war and put back together. But also, at the same time, he focused on recent projects, such as the socialist realist Marszałkowska housing district, known usually as MDM, the Marszałkowska Dzielnica Mieszkaniowa, the initials. Wojciechowski praised the mosaics, the sgraffito, and the extensive reliefs that adorn the complex. And here I'm showing you some of them with myself, therefore, for scale. These are the reliefs. This is a mosaic clock and sgraffito facades with emblems of Warsaw. It's completely covered in stuff. And Wojciechowski was a big fan of all of it. He saw them as examples of art that is applied to a specific architectural context and thus becomes useful for society. A recurring motif of the discourse of synthesis in post-war Eastern Europe that I think in this case is expressed with great clarity. The book appeared in 1955, at a time when both the politics and the aesthetics of Stalinism in Poland were in limbo. Despite the fact that this was the year when the Warsaw Palace of Culture, seen here, was inaugurated. This is the infamous present of Stalin to the Polish people. It was also a time when the upcoming turn towards modernist, if not eventually outright avant-garde, art and architecture of the later 50s was already palpable, if you knew where to look. The final two essays in Wojciechowski's anthology each focused on a recent project that, in retrospect, showed such changes in Polish art. The first was a monumental ensemble to the Polish insurrections against the Germans in Silesia following World War I, erected in the small village of Góra Świętej Anny, which is between Wrocław and Katowice, near the Czech border. So this was erected in 54-55, and it commemorates an event from the 20s, insurrection of ethnic Poles against the Germans. This was a German territory in the interwar period that, following World War II, was given to Poland. So there was a lot of activity of kind of re-signifying this as a Polish territory and excavating part of the history. That's where this monument comes in. It was designed by the sculptor Ksawery Dunikowski, a Jew who actually produced a lot of some of the earliest art that related to the Holocaust, actually, in Poland. The monument reformed the visual language of socialist realist war monuments into a more austere, restrained style. And you see this very kind of emphatic cubic shape, the extreme flatness of the reliefs. It could be a work of the 30s in some ways, kind of classicist modernism of sorts. Finally, Wojciechowski praised the first drafts of the daring, unabashedly modernist project for the Vianca Stadium in Warsaw, which was produced by an interdisciplinary team consisting of architects Jerzy Soltan and Zbigniew Ichnatowicz, the painter Wojciech Fangor, who created this image here too, and the sculptor Franciszek Strynkiewicz. So this is a project that was never built, started in '54, which is very early, participating in competitions. The fact that it was kind of kept going means that there was a certain openness for a work like this, with this very interesting biomorphic openings in the wall in bright orange that was actually designed by a painter. So there was this idea that painters and architects would change roles. This is a kind of a different model of synthesis that I have worked a lot on, but I'm not going to get into it here. So this is the kind of tail end of Wojciechowski's book. Imagine, he starts with the Stalinist stuff and he ends with this. A year after the publication of the book, Wojciechowski, who kept publishing an article every month or two, would return to the same project, which had been further elaborated, with an essay called So That Architecture Becomes Art Again. Aby architektura znów stala się sztuką. The critic praised the collaborative ethos that generated it, which allowed for formal investigations that would normally lie outside of the purview of architecture. He described the external wall of the swimming pool, the orange element you see here, as painting in cement, implying that this new model of synthesis was not about adding art to architecture, but rather abolishing the distinctions between the two. And a quote, "The constructor adapts the cement forms to the visions of the painter. The painter forms his ideas while aware of the capabilities of industrial materials. The sculptor works with the mass of the entire project and not just the decorative details." End quote. After the publication of the book, during the period of the thaw proper, Wojciechowski continued to push the agenda for useful art beyond 1956 and until the end of the decade. In a series of articles published in Przegląd Artystyczny, he continued to adapt his concept in response to the ever-changing political conditions. A month after the appearance of his book, he wrote an article entitled Art and Technology, which discussed H55, an exhibition in Helsingborg, Sweden, which consisted mostly of modernist interior design. Wojciechowski, and I'm not showing it to you, I think you can imagine mid-century Danish chairs. Wojciechowski's review was enthusiastic. He was enthralled by contemporary Scandinavian design, which he interpreted as a significant step towards the democratization of art. For a writer that had been championing the mosaics and stone reliefs of the MDM housing only 3 years prior, this shift of emphasis to modern design appears like a complete about-face. Yet for the critic, Scandinavian interiors were the new true embodiments of useful art. And he sought to introduce them to the discussions of art in socialist Poland that he was actively part of. For this reason, he was quick to underscore the social engagement of the designers in Scandinavia, who often produced objects for state housing projects, such as that of Vällingby in the outskirts of Stockholm, a kind of modernist new town. He thus perhaps implied an affinity between Scandinavian social democracy and Eastern European post-Stalinist state socialism, or even suggested that the Scandinavian model could be emulated in Poland. And that is the moment of the peak of reform communism. This might sound like wishful thinking, but it was part of the climate, I think, of the time. This chameleonic critical enterprise is a prime example of the difficult balance between continuity and change that defined the culture of the thaw in many parts of the Soviet bloc. Yet I do believe that there is a difference in the way this semantic instability, in the terms discussed here, operated in the Soviet Union and Poland during the period. While both helped ease the transitions of the thaw, these proceeded differently in each case. In the critical practice of Wojciechowski, the process of redefining the decorative arts was one of continuous substitution. On every stage, a single art form was suggested as the best example of applied and useful art, which was soon replaced by another. Reliefs were replaced by mosaics, mosaics by printed fabrics, fabrics by furniture, and so on. The result was a gradual rejection of Stalinist forms and an unwavering affirmation of modernist styles and modes of production. So at the end, there's no Stalinist form left in this conception, right? You take one in, you throw one out. That's the process. And it's important to note that Wojciechowski became, if some of you work in Poland, you probably have encountered him. He was, curator of Polish pavilions in the Venice Biennial in the 70s and champion of installations and other things, so he really moved along, and it's probably nobody's willing to deal with what he was writing about under Stalinism in a way. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, I think that the expansion of the decorative did not entail substitution. Decorative art was mosaics and clothes and cars and lacquered boxes and furniture, etc. In other words, modernism was added to the mix, but did not substitute the well-established forms of decorative arts from the 30s or prior. This continued until the end of the Soviet era. In 1989, a large 2-volume survey of Soviet decorative arts was published. First volume was pre-war, second volume you see here is post-war. Edited by a large group of experts led by Vasily Tolstoy, who had been a frequent contributor to Decorativne искусство. In a sense, the volume represents a scholarly systematization of the eclectic mix of decorative art that had been constructed in the previous decades. And you see here, I'm not going to go through it, but the contents actually have exhaustive categories of decorative art. The many realms of the decorative are carefully categorized, listed, and analyzed. Extending into the late 1970s, this ever-growing mix of art shows little change from the 1950s. And here, I'm showing you the updated version of the previous slide. If the expanded notion of the decorative helped explode Stalinist total work during the thaw, as I tried to argue here, the debris was still around for decades to come. Thank you.